This presentation was prepared for the bicentennial of the War of 1812, well, over 10 years ago now, and it's designed to give you a local perspective from North Carolina's perspective on the war, the causes of it, the course of it, and the people involved, and then the aftermath, and also to give you some sense of what records pertain to North Carolinians involved in the war that you can look into. There's an accompanying handout. If you will contact me at the email address that appears in the lower right-hand corner of the slide, I'll gladly send that to you via email. So I hope this is of some assistance to you. So the War of 1812 is one of those wars that we really speak less about, that we hear less about, except during that bicentennial period. And we tend really to focus on just a few of our wars: the Revolution, the Civil War, the World War II, and sometimes World War I, but many of the others we tend to let fade into the background because they're less clear-cut, and the results of the wars and the causes behind them are a little more difficult to ferret out and understand. So let's just start with the basics. What was the War of 1812 all about? Anyway, it's a much easier question to ask than it is to answer. Certainly we can point to causes whose urgency built to a crisis point over time. The Democratic-Republican Party, whose successor is today's Democratic Party, headed by President Jefferson, did everything it could to stop economic sanctions against Britain and France. For example, through the very famous Embargo Act of 1807, which banned all exports from this country, and the non-intercourse measures of 1809, which banned exports to Britain and France alone. And they hoped by these measures to avoid outright conflict with either of those countries, because there was an ongoing war. You may have heard of it in Europe that lasted decades, called the Napoleonic Wars. Although the grievance against the British and the French stretched all the way back to the late 1790s, some of the points of contention were moot by the time the war was actually declared in June of 1812. So among those causes, we will find several different factors. Here on the slide you see President Madison, Jefferson's hand-picked successor, struggling with his Embargo Act, which is represented by the "Oh Grab Me," the snapping turtle that is illustrated at the bottom. And if you read "Oh Grab Me" backwards, you see that it's actually the embargo that's being referenced here. So the first problem that was of great concern to Americans was the impressment of seamen off American ships. Britain had been fighting a 2-decade-long war against Republican France and then Imperial France under Napoleon. Its manpower was seriously depleted, and many British sailors joined American ships because they were better treated and better paid. But the British felt it their right to stop American ships. They were in serious need of manpower, and they would seize the British sailors off these ships. Over 6,200 were seized between 1803 and 1812. Now, some of these seizures were certainly justified, but some individuals were conscripted by the British in error. Sailors often produced certificates of citizenship to prove their status as Americans, but these were frequently forged papers. And others simply sported tattoos of American eagles and flags and claimed that that was their evidence of their nationality. Naturally, these failed to make an impression upon British naval officers. In general, their attitude was, once a British citizen, always a British citizen. In one famous incident in 1807, a British warship called the Leopard fired on an American naval frigate, the Chesapeake, near Cape Henry at the mouth of Chesapeake Bay, in an attempt to retrieve British sailors. 3 crew members were killed in that engagement and 8 were wounded. But this was still 5 years before the outbreak of the war, officially. By 1814, Britain had stopped its policy of impressment because Napoleon had been toppled. In fact, it began to discharge sailors by that time, but the War of 1812 continued. A second concern was restraint of trade. The United States, following President Washington's advice, was a neutral power in the conflict between Britain and France. Naturally, Americans took sides individually, and in general, Federalists tended to be Anglophiles and Democratic Republicans Francophiles. Both European powers were concerned to impede the flow of American goods, particularly material of war, to their opponents, and both stopped American ships and seized cargo. In 1807, the British Parliament passed, or rather the British executive passed orders in council which required American ships taking goods to continental Europe to stop in Britain and pay a duty first. Now that was tantamount to making the United States an economic dependency of Great Britain, but it was really designed to give an advantage to British West Indian planters. American shipping between the French West Indies and Europe was thought to be depressing coffee and sugar prices for British producers. The French responded with Napoleon's Milan Decree of December 1807. Any American ship complying with the orders in council were to be considered essentially British and subject to seizure by the French Navy. In the end, the French seized far more vessels than the British, 558 as opposed to 389, which puzzled some observers as to why we declared war on Britain rather than France. Wood Jones Hamlin of Halifax, North Carolina, was one of those who felt that the United States should declare war on both France and Britain, but recognized how impractical that would be. As a friend in Virginia wrote to him, "Bonaparte is a dog also. I most sincerely wish we possessed the means of flogging both the English and the French rascals until they were both honest, but it would take all the timber between here and Roanoke." In the end, bread riots in England in 1811 and the complaints of English cotton manufacturers due to the embargo caused the council to rescind the offensive trade restrictions on the 16th of June, 1812. Interestingly, that rescission coincides almost exactly with the declaration of war by the United States on the 18th of June, 1812. In effect, then, the outbreak of war seems like a comedy of errors. If the rescission had come just a month earlier, perhaps the war would never have been declared. Neither country was realistically advantaged by prosecuting a war. The American regular army totaled under 6,000 men, with a contingent of only 17 seaworthy ships in its navy in spite of all John Adams' efforts to build it up. Efforts to expand the Navy further had been largely stymied in Congress. Oddly enough, though, the greatest American victories came at sea. Britain, on the other hand, commanded hundreds of thousands of soldiers worldwide, 40 times the tax revenue of the United States, and 1,000 ships. Clearly, the United States would have difficulty facing such odds. Not only that, but it was argued that the Americans were giving an advantage to the French by opening up a North American front. A victory for Napoleon would not have been in America's interest, since he had designs on world empire, including the reclamation of Louisiana, which he'd sold to Jefferson. Likewise, the British did not desire a diversion of resources to North America, which would impair the land war in Europe and further burden the British taxpayer. Many felt that Americans should bear some of the costs in their gargantuan struggle with Napoleon. The mutual disadvantage caused by the declaration explains the statement of one British bureaucrat. He quipped that the United States and Great Britain were like two men holding their heads in buckets of water to see who would drown first. A third factor in the outbreak of the war was land hunger and fears of Indian aggression. Westerners were key players in the declaration of war. The British had not relinquished forts in the Old Northwest until the 1790s, but British traders and agents were still active on the American frontier. When Western land hunger in Ohio and Indiana led to direct conflict with the Indians there, a movement began among them led by a Shawnee chief, Tecumseh, and his brother Tenskwatawa, known also as the Prophet, to bring all the Western tribes under one confederacy to oppose American incursions on tribal lands as one. Tecumseh actively sought British assistance as he traveled to the Creeks in Mississippi Territory to encourage their support. Naturally, citizens of Kentucky, Tennessee, Georgia, Indiana, and Ohio were terrified of the prospect of organized Indian resistance backed by the British. They also cast a greedy eye toward Canadian land and the Floridas. Many believed, with growing resentment, that Easterners were indifferent to their interests. Another key concern was keeping the lifeline of the Mississippi and the port of New Orleans open to trade. Eventually, during the war, the British would make an effort to capture New Orleans, which, if successful, would have been a major coup with significant consequences for the inhabitants of the Trans-Appalachian West. But certainly the Western Party could not have brought the declaration of war without collusion from Eastern allies. In the end, it was probably wounded honor at the many infractions on American autonomy by Britain, along with entrenched hatred of the British, which most galvanized support for the war. But to many, especially commercial interests concentrated in New England, it still seemed an ill-advised charade. In fact, even though the recension of orders in council were unknown here in America in June of 1812, there was a considerable degree of opposition to declaring war right up until the end. In fact, until the late 20th century, I don't think we've seen a war in which Americans disagreed so heartily about the necessity of fighting. These attitudes were reflected in the final congressional vote on President Madison's war resolution. In the Senate, out of 32 votes cast, 13 were in opposition. In the House, 79 supported the declaration and 39 voted against it. Though in general, Federalists, seated most powerfully in New England, but whose influence was on the decline at this point, were more likely to oppose the war, and Democratic Republicans were more likely to support it. Opponents came from both sides of the aisle. In point of fact, it's easier to distinguish opponents from supporters by looking at younger versus older and Western versus Eastern members of Congress. Older members were more hesitant to challenge Britain because the trials of the Revolution were apparent to them from their own experience, and younger members were more eager to defend the nation's honor. As we've seen, Westerners, led by the famed orator Henry Clay, who was on the make at this point, tended to be war hawks because they feared British influence in the Floridas and Canada and in the Old Northwest among hostile Indian tribes. They also hoped to expand U.S. territory by invading Canada and even Florida. 3 separate attempts were made at Canada with absolutely no success. The government claimed that the invasions, which followed similar failed tactics employed during the Revolutionary War, were ostensibly designed to hold Canada hostage and bring the war to an early end, but these attempts only stirred up more opposition among Americans. Opponents, including several North Carolina delegates, claimed they would give their life's blood for defense of their country, but not a drop for a war of aggression to satisfy American land hunger. This divide in American society reappeared during the Mexican War, with the expansion of slavery thrown into the mix. Then also the 12th Congress, elected in 1810, included 59 freshman members and a strong Democratic-Republican majority. The war resolution might have been impossible without the shift in congressional control and demographics. So, how did North Carolina's interests compare to the national causes of war? Well, there was little fear of the Cherokee, who remained well disposed toward the United States, and were the most acculturated of the southeastern tribes. There was only occasional alarm over alleged horse thieving by the Cherokee in Georgia, which was probably greatly exaggerated. Rumors of the distribution of British rifles among them in advance of the war were completely unfounded. It's true that the Cherokee headmen gave a hearing to Tecumseh and the prophet's pleas, and held a great council at Ustinali to craft a response. The prophet is reported to have argued that they give up their white ways and join the fight. Put off the white man's dress, throw away the mills and looms, kill the cats, put on paint and buckskins, and be Indians again. Apparently, the prophet predicted a violent hailstorm to underline the threat posed by the whites, but it never materialized, and when a Cherokee woman was killed by Tecumseh's allies, the Creeks at Etowah, the Cherokee were firmly in the American camp from that point. Between 500 and 800 Cherokee braves assisted Andrew Jackson in putting down a Creek uprising in the winter and spring of 1814, most notably at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend. Included among their number was the Chief Sequoyah, best known for his later creation of the Cherokee alphabet. Ironically, during his presidency, Andrew Jackson would later refuse to enforce the Supreme Court's decision in favor of the treaty obligations of the United States toward the Cherokee against the state of Georgia, and ordered their removal, leading to the Trail of Tears. Chief Junaluska later reportedly remarked, "If I had known that Jackson would drive us from our homes, I would have killed him that day at the Horseshoe." Western territorial acquisition provoked more opposition than support among North Carolinians because it made the U.S. the aggressor. North Carolina's congressional delegation reluctantly supported invasion of Canada and annexation of Florida as measures of war on the whole. North Carolinians were more interested in migrating to Alabama or Tennessee rather than to the old Northwest at this point. When it comes to North Carolina and international trade, her involvement was minuscule compared to other states. Between 1802 and 1812, she averaged 1.67% of America's total exports, the least of any southern state. One reason why we were called the Rip Van Winkle state at the time. The chief export was naval stores, and that was probably improved by the declaration of war. Most of her vessels were smaller and involved in intercoastal rather than transatlantic trade. Imports did improve during the war due to the strict blockade of New York and New England, but few would say that North Carolina fell into line with the hope that its commercial influence would grow as a result. Impressment, too, was not a significant issue from a practical standpoint because so few North Carolinians actually were sailors at risk of capture by the British. In 1806, only 101 registered sailors in the United States out of 10,722 total hailed from North Carolina. Of the total number of impressed seamen, which numbered close to 6,000 by June of 1814, only 30 of them, at most, were from North Carolina. So North Carolina was not at the center of the maelstrom by any means. Wounded national pride and dislike of Great Britain, stretching back to the Revolution, was the main reason that North Carolinians rallied, as it was nationwide. Just to show how strong these anti-British feelings were, in 1812, when Governor Hawkins was receiving numerous petitions for commissions in the militia from influential North Carolinians, he was advised that Colonel Nathan Horton of the 5th Division in Wilkes County was unsuitable for his position because he and his family held loyalist sentiments during the Revolution, then almost 30 years in the rearview mirror. As in almost all wars, there were those in North Carolina who doubted the wisdom of tweaking Great Britain's nose. 3 members of North Carolina's congressional delegation voted against the war at the outset. Others joined the criticism of Washington's handling of the war, particularly the invasion of Canada, the lack of competent officers, inadequate defense of the North Carolina coast, and inadequate funding for supplies for the soldiers raised in this state. The power of the federal government to declare militia units detached, incorporate them into regular units of the Army, and remove them from the state drew criticism, as did the policy of conscription from the militia to fill detached unit quotas when volunteers were insufficient. These were thought to be overweening powers that the president did not possess under the Constitution, and they left the state with less than adequate defense in case of direct attack. The list of prominent North Carolinians who were critics of the war is impressive. 4 have counties named for them. 2 were ex-governors of the state. They included John Steele, William Gaston, William R. Davie, Archibald D. Murphy, John Stanley, David Stone, Duncan Cameron, Archibald McBride, Joseph Pearson, Richard Stanford, and Colonel William Polk, who was originally offered a brigadier general's office in the 6th Military District but refused it. Some said on political grounds, but others because he was loath to give up his lucrative job as president of the Bank of North Carolina in Raleigh. The most notorious political fight was in the General Assembly in 1813 over whether to censure Senator David Stone, who appears on this slide, because of his anti-administration votes in Washington. In those days, the General Assembly elected United States senators, it must be remembered. After receiving numerous petitions from various citizens across the state, the Assembly did vote to censure Stone, and he resigned voluntarily afterwards. But about a third of the upper and lower chambers voted in favor of Stone. Another indicator of the division in Raleigh came in another 1813 vote on a memorial to the president requesting greater protection for the North Carolina coast. This address included an expression of confidence in the president's handling of the war. The Senate passed it by the slight majority of 30 to 29. The citizens at large also showed some reluctance, but this varied widely from place to place. For instance, in Granville County, not one member of the militia volunteered to be detached to regular forces. Rowan County was strongly Federalist and quite hostile to the war. Colonel Welborn sometimes felt hampered in his recruitment and training efforts based at Salisbury, and because of this, he moved his headquarters to his own home near Wilkesboro. In Orange County, only about half the required number of men volunteered. The remainder had to be drafted from the militia by lot. In other counties like Wake, there were more volunteers than required. In Colonel Jesse Pearson's regiment, detached to assist with putting down the creeks, a band of Lincoln County riflemen positively mutinied and remained behind. Members of pacifist sects like the Moravians and the Quakers disciplined members who obeyed the call to arms. Actually, the state law, which had permitted an exemption for conscientious objectors on religious grounds, was rescinded by the legislators at this time. The response of the Moravians was to create a fund for hiring substitutes for those of their number drafted. Desertions were quite common, and long lists of rewards were printed in the newspapers. On 2 occasions, an amnesty was offered. Finally, the state legislature came down with some rather harsh penalties for deserting militia. There were also commercial interests on the coast who continued to do business with the enemy through the British ships involved in the blockade. Some had passes to go to Bermuda or Nova Scotia to ply their wares. Others traded foodstuffs directly with the British Navy. Most notorious was the Caleb Etheridge Malachi Jones trade ring in Currituck County, which concealed shipments of beef to the enemy in a cargo of shingles purportedly bound for Baltimore. The ships returned much too quickly, which aroused suspicion. Interestingly, Major Etheridge early in the war had petitioned the governor to keep Currituck's militia from being stationed elsewhere for fear of British landings and cattle theft, like those which had occurred during the Revolution. As usual, in times of war, people who doubted the justness of the fight, and even those who merely opposed the president with regard to his conduct of the war, were sometimes branded as traitors. North Carolinians stood up for their right to dissent, as guaranteed by the Constitution. Congressman Joseph Pearson of Rowan County, in response to allegations of treason by his colleague Felix Grundy of Tennessee, gave a stirring retort that bears repeating. Let this doctrine be once established, an ambitious executive and a weak, a wicked, or an interested majority of Congress have nothing to do but declare war under any pretense or for any cause or object, however unimportant or however destructive of our best interests, we will be bound to strengthen the arm lifted for our own destruction, join in a claim of praise to our destroyers, or sit by in silent anguish awaiting the death blow to our Constitution, and with it the liberties of our liberties as a people. Apparently, many of the people of North Carolina approved of the conduct of their dissenting congressional representatives. The Raleigh Minerva, a Federalist newspaper, was continually singing their praises. The people of Lexington toasted the dissenters in 1814, lifting a glass to the minority in the last Congress. Their conduct suited the times, decidedly superior in intellect and eloquence. Their friends must admire their bold and manly exposition of the wickedness and imbecility of our rulers. Though there was significant grumbling about the war in the state, on the whole, most North Carolinians were tremendously supportive of the conflict. And as we've seen, the country was in an extremely poor state of preparedness. Something had to be done to redress those deficiencies. British naval power was world-renowned, and the eastern seaboard could be sure of a blockade and even perhaps raids or more serious attacks on coastal areas. Intercoastal shipping was likely to come under fire. The federal government did relatively little to offer protection, but it did exact financial burdens on the citizens of North Carolina, which they largely cheerfully accepted. Special taxes were imposed on stills, on retail licenses, sales at auction, sugar, carriages, banknotes, and salt. In 1814, the tax on stills in North Carolina garnered the sixth highest total out of 22 states. In 1813, a direct federal tax was levied by population, and in 1815, a second tax was assessed on property valuations in land and slaves. Although she ranked 8th in total property for this second levy, North Carolina collected the 4th highest amount of any state. Furthermore, treasury notes were issued which North Carolinians purchased. On occasion, the state's banks loaned the state money on short notice to buy emergency supplies. What North Carolina got in return from Washington was fairly negligible, at least with regard to her local defense. Only small contingents of regular troops were posted to the state, almost all of them either at Wilmington or Beaufort. Many of her best trained local detachments, raised by General Pinckney's adjutants for the Southern or 6th Military District, were withdrawn from the state for service elsewhere. Coastal fortifications at Wilmington, Fort Johnston, and Beaufort, Fort Hampton, were improved mostly with local effort. Even after repeated complaints from the governor and legislature, the president and secretary of war tended to point out that there were insufficient resources to protect the entire coast, and more exposed and likely targets would have to be prioritized over North Carolina. Only 5 gunboats were ever dispatched to North Carolina. The governor even had some initially difficulty in getting full authority to dispatch the detached militia units in his state at will in cases of emergency. The chain of command was muddied, as was the procurement apparatus for these troops. Most were ill-equipped, poorly outfitted with modern arms, and lacked necessary tents and blankets. It took some time to get the arms stored in the arsenal at Fayetteville released on federal authority, and former Governor Benjamin Smith would not hand over 2 brass cannon in his possession to Governor Hawkins until ordered to do so by the War Department. A few old cannon dating from 1775 were held by a private citizen at Edenton. Of course, the remaining militia were at the governor's disposal, but they were less well trained. And whereas coastal defense was a federal concern, there was little clarity as to who would end up footing the bill when they were called. In the end, North Carolina spent around $400,000 of its own funds, much of which it had borrowed. A great deal of this debt was assumed by the federal government immediately. Still, with regard to disputed expenditures, after an extensive audit, the state requested an additional sum of about $31,000 at the end of the war with 6% interest annually to cover the balance due. Astonishingly, the responsible congressional committee did not approve settling those claims until 1916, 100 years later. In the end, the funds were never appropriated by Congress. It should be said that the war brought hardship to the home front in North Carolina. Although almost no one, except for a few coastal inhabitants, experienced the violence of that war, most did experience the privation brought about by the blockade and the paralysis of commerce. Goods that had to be transported any distance were expensive. These included things like coffee, rice, sugar, flour, and salt. At the same time, prices of agricultural goods declined due to the loss of the European market. There was a glut of produce in the United States. Taxes were high because of the need to finance the war. Debtors were in such a bad position that the state legislature passed a law allowing 2 years for repayment of debts with damages. Added to all this, 1813 brought a severe drought that didn't improve much in 1814. The soldiers going to the defense of Norfolk in 1814 tried not to travel en masse, but used various routes so that they could avoid placing too much strain on the water supply. Whiskey seemed to be the only thing that was in plentiful supply, and the price of that was falling, so I guess there was some consolation. Regular regiments of volunteers were recruited from North Carolina early in the war to make up Major General Thomas Pinckney's full complement of troops in the 6th Military District. The one which contained the most North Carolina volunteers, around 500, was the 10th Regiment, based at Salisbury and commanded by Colonel James Welborn. It was moved northward in the winter of 1813 to 1814, but saw little action. Colonel Welborn was never in command in the field. He was left behind to continue recruitment because he was so good at it. He had enemies who alleged that he was milking the public coffers for his expenses and was not suited to his position. He was also fond of complaining about his situation. This explains his unpopularity in Washington. Only one battalion of the 10th served in a combat situation. The advance down the Chateauguay River in an abortive push toward Montreal, led by General Wade Hampton. This was not a very impressive engagement. A much inferior Canadian force gave the impression of being much larger by making a great noise of bugle fanfare from the surrounding trees, and the Americans cautiously halted their advance. Since another prong of this attack, descending the St. Lawrence River, also proved to be a disaster, it was probably for the best. North Carolinians also served in several rifle companies, in addition to the 12th, 13th, 15th, and 43rd Infantry, about 1,200 all told. Inducements were offered the volunteers, and these increased as the war progressed. An enlistment bonus of $4 was offered in 1812, but by 1813, the bonuses were increased to $16 per man, along with the promise of 160 acres of bounty land in the West at the end of the war, and an additional 3 months' pay upon honorable discharge. The vast majority of North Carolinians who served in any capacity, however, were militiamen, taken from North Carolina's 50,000-strong reserve force of men aged between 18 and 45. These were weekend warriors, equivalent to the National Guard today, but far less sophisticated in their training and equipment, and intended for purely local defense anyway, using their own weapons. But it was within the power of the United States government to detach them to federal service and send them outside the state under federal officers. However, they had to be mustered in the presence of regular Army officers or a federal inspector and had their muster rolls certified in order for the United States to assume responsibility for paying them. The detached militia were formed by quota from each county militia, on average about 70 men per county. Volunteers were first requested among the men assembled, and if the quota wasn't filled at that point, then lots were cast, or every 10th man was taken. A person could hire a substitute if drafted in this way, however. There were 2 major calls for 7,000 detached militia, one in the summer of 1813 and the second time early in 1815. In 1813, the threat was Admiral Coburn's raid on the Carolina coast. In 1815, 15 companies assembled at Wadesboro so that they could be dispatched to assist at New Orleans. In 1813, the troops were only needed for a few days because the threat receded quickly as Coburn put out to sea again. In 1815, news came of the victory at New Orleans and the signing of the treaty before the troops were even dispatched. Because in the first instance, no federal officers were present, and in the second, the troops were never deployed, the state of North Carolina had difficulty in getting the federal government to pay for their expenses in these events. It appointed a board of auditors to help strengthen its claim for the 1815 muster and the costs of coastal defense. The records created by the auditors are a key element in the documentation for the war that you will find in Raleigh. There were also several smaller deployments of detached militia. In June 1812, at the very outbreak of the war, troops were called and sent to the coast to hold the key forts until regulars could replace them. Far more troops were available then than were needed, and only those in counties like near Wilmington and Beaufort were used. They were there only 6 months at the longest. Another regiment of detached North Carolina militia, mostly from the western part of the state, served under Colonel Jesse A. Pearson with Andrew Jackson against the Creeks in 1814. This unit saw many hardships on its outward march, but it arrived too late to take part in the fighting. It did participate in the building of several forts, however, and in what was generically termed mopping up operations, which involved the destruction of several Indian villages and the capture of 540 Creek warriors. The entire operation lasted about 6 months. The only other major troop deployment from North Carolina came between September 1814 and February 1815, when several thousand ordinary militiamen gathered at Gates Courthouse and Hillsborough and then marched to Norfolk, Virginia. This occurred just after Admiral Coburn's burning of Washington. It was thought that Norfolk could be next on Coburn's list, and the governor of Virginia was grateful for the help, though in the end it proved unnecessary. Future Governor James Iredell, Jr. was a young officer in this expedition. Free people of color did attempt to join the militia in various places, but most of these were sent home. However, it is undoubtedly the case that some African Americans did serve on the American side in a support capacity, probably in the building of defenses and in the privateers and gunboats protecting the harbors. 2 free men of color were killed by an explosion aboard gunboat number 146 in 1814. The only important military engagement which took place geographically within North Carolina was Admiral Sir George Coburn's raid at Ocracoke in July of 1813. There had been many smaller raids on American shipping traveling the intercoastal waterway through North Carolina's canals, bays, and sounds. This route became very important during the war because the open seaways were blockaded, and overland routes and ferries were overloaded with commercial traffic diverted from the sea. Sometimes the British conducted raids merely to gather supplies of grain and beef from the locals. They often tried to capture pilots to help guide them through treacherous channels. It was feared that they might be interested in raiding the banks in several North Carolina coastal towns like Edenton or New Bern and Washington, North Carolina, but this threat never actually came to pass. They certainly wanted to chase down privateering vessels who preyed upon British shipping and took refuge in North Carolina waters. Occasionally, the British took on fleeing slaves from the coastal region and incorporated them into their crews. It's estimated that several thousand escaped slaves were with Coburn, and the idea of these former slaves falling upon coastal settlements and the plantations of former masters was terrifying to white inhabitants. There were rumors of slave revolts up and down the coast, but most of these were just provoked by hysteria. There seems to be no real evidence of an imminent threat. Admiral Coburn arrived at Ocracoke with 4 frigates, a brig, and 3 schooners carrying 2,000 men. When the local customs agent, Thomas S. Singleton, sighted them, he dispatched all his money and papers aboard the revenue cutter Mercury with the directions to warn officials in the city of New Bern nearby. Though hotly pursued, the Mercury managed to carry out its mission. Largely because of the protection offered by 2 privateering vessels, the Anaconda, and the Atlas. The British landed in force at Portsmouth and Ocracoke. They acted abominably, raiding homes, ripping up bed ticking for valuables, breaking furniture, and taking clothing. They destroyed Singleton's law books when they found nothing of value in his office. 200 cattle, 400 sheep, and 1,600 fowl were requisitioned. The British did offer $1,600 to the locals, but this was considered insufficient. Singleton himself was taken prisoner and held hostage until the fleet departed, at which time he was set adrift in a small boat. The privateer, the Anaconda, was captured and accompanied the British fleet. The most amazing thing about this raid was the swift response that it provoked in Raleigh and in eastern North Carolina. Express dispatches went immediately to the capital. Within a few days, militiamen from all over the region were arriving at Newbern. Supplies and munitions were acquired on short notice from Raleigh, Fayetteville, and Norfolk. The governor himself arrived in person to take charge of the situation and inspect fortifications. The state and local governments had acted swiftly and responsibly to address the crisis. Despite the overall limited number of North Carolinians who actually served in a military capacity during the war, we do have a few very important men, heroes, who participated from our state, so you should know more about them. One of these was Major Benjamin Forsyth. He was probably North Carolina's most dashing hero of the war. He was a resident of Stokes County, and he owned about 3,000 acres there, where he was also married and had 6 children. He represented Stokes in the General Assemblies of 1807 and 1808, and shortly after this service, he was commissioned a captain in the United States Rifle Regiment. It was part of the regular army, later known as the Rifle Corps. Now, this was an elite division of its day, like the Green Beret. A large number of North Carolinians had joined the small unit, many attracted by the uniforms and Forsyth's fame. His regiment was employed to provide cover and open bridgeheads for troop movements into Canada. It participated in cross-border attacks on Gananoque, Elizabethtown, York, which was the capital of Upper Canada, Fort George, Chrysler's Island, and Odelltown. The most famous raid was that on Elizabethtown, in which he took a party of volunteers on a 12-mile march up the American bank, across the frozen St. Lawrence River, and back down the Canadian bank on a night raid upon an unsuspecting garrison. He thereby liberated American prisoners, captured 52 British troops, and 134 stands of arms, which had been taken earlier in the war from the Americans at the fall of Detroit. He instantly became a sensation in his home state. He was killed in a second failed attempt to capture Odelltown in 1814. He'd been ordered to draw the enemy into an ambuscade by attacking, retreating, and waiting for the enemy under cover. But he disobeyed orders and made a direct challenge to the advancing British. He was shot through the collarbone and was the only person killed in the engagement. He was buried at Champlain, and his obituary said of him, "He was the terror of the enemy and among the best partisan officers of the war." But like any daring officer desirous of acclaim, his commanders had mixed feelings about him, believing him rather ungovernable, vainglorious, and oblivious to the larger issues at stake in any given operation. His raids on the enemy often provoked counterattacks that were equally devastating. His son's education, however, was paid for by North Carolina, and a presentation sword was presented to him. In 1849, the legislature named a neighboring county after him from the southern part of his native county of Stokes. Secondly, we have Colonel William McCree. He came from a famous military family in Wilmington. His father was Major Griffith John McCree of the North Carolina Continentals during the Revolution. His brother Samuel was a major during the Mexican War, and he had a brother-in-law who was a naval surgeon. An attendee at West Point, McCree was trained as an engineer and served in the regular army as such in the Charleston Department right up to the outbreak of the war, at which time he was created a major. He worked on fortifications at Savannah and helped to construct a military hospital at Charleston. He then made an assessment of the prospects of capturing St. Augustine, Florida, which caused General Pinckney to hesitate on his original plan and solicited his highest esteem. Pinckney was very sorry to lose McCree when he was created chief engineer and chief of artillery for General Wade Hampton in his attacks near Montreal. He participated in the Battle of Niagara and in the defense of Fort Erie, where he manned an artillery piece for a while himself. And he constructed a bridge across the Chippewa River for capturing British artillery on the heights of Niagara. In all of these matters, he impressed his officers. General Winfield Scott said of him, "In my opinion, and perhaps in that of the whole army, he combined more genius and military science with high courage than any other officer who participated in the War of 1812. McCree continued in the regular army until 1819, when he resigned his commission, largely in a fit of pique that a French general had been placed over him in an assessment of coastal defenses. Later, he served as Surveyor General in Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas territories. McCree never married, but was devoted to his books. He lived frugally, but was very generous to his friends. He died of cholera at St. Louis, just as he had been commissioned to survey the boundary between the U.S. and Mexico in 1833. The third hero of the war I want to mention is pictured in the rather flamboyant monument that you see in the slide. Captain Otway Burns was a native of Onslow County and resident of Beaufort at the outbreak of the war. His father died when he was quite young, and so he went to sea, where he was involved in the carrying trade for many years prior to the war. In 1812, he purchased a Maryland-built merchant schooner, the Zephyr, in New York, and he converted it for military use, renaming it the Snapdragon. He received letters of marque and reprisal, which allowed him to prey upon British merchant ships, capturing them, selling their cargo, and dividing the spoils with his men and his investors, who'd helped him to refit the vessel. Privateers were lightly armed, and thus speed was of the essence in enabling them to elude British warships. Burns was not welcomed by many in New Bern when he attempted to recruit men there. Some New Bern residents opposed privateering operations because they believed the British would rain down vengeance upon their city. Many of them were not sympathetic to the war for commercial reasons. He used hardball tactics to fill up his quota, capsizing a boat of 6 constables who were attempting to detain some of his recruits for debt, and throwing F.X. Martin of New Bern into the news for calling him a licensed robber. The Snapdragon had a very successful career, trawling the waters in the West Indies, Newfoundland, and Ocracoke, before she was finally captured in 1814 by the British sloop of war Martin. Once, Burns captured a British slave ship and allowed some of the slaves to join his crew, but others he sold for profit. Over the course of his privateering career, he secured several millions of dollars for himself, crew, and investors. He continued with a variety of enterprises after the war, including opening a salt works and a brickyard. He even built the first steamship in the state at Swansboro, which he called the Prometheus, and which was involved in Cape Fear River trading. He served as an assemblyman and a state senator through the 1820s and 30s, but lost his seat because of a vote in 1835 to increase the representation for western counties and provide for direct election of the governor by the people rather than the legislature. His single vote made the difference in the bill passing the Senate and won him no favor at home, but people in the western county of Yancey named Burnsville after him. In his old age, he fell into debt, but was appointed by the president as the keeper of the Branch Shoals Lighthouse at Portsmouth. He died in 1850, aged 75, and is buried at Beaufort in the Ann Street Cemetery beneath a monument into which is cemented one of his cannons from the Snapdragon. The last hero of the war was a naval officer, Captain Johnston Blakely, a native of Ireland, born about 1781 at Seaford in County Down. However, he grew up in Wilmington, and he attended the University of North Carolina, where he was president of the Philanthropic Society. Physically, he was quite impressive. A lady later described him in his youth as very handsome. and the exceeding whiteness of his teeth and the brightness of his eyes I shall never forget. My mother has often described him to us as rather small but well made, with very black hair and eyes, grave and gentlemanly in his deportment, but at the same time cheerful and easy when at home. Blakely joined the Navy because he was orphaned quite young, and his inheritance was decimated by a warehouse fire in Wilmington. He began as a midshipman and served under Captain John Rogers and Captain Stephen Decatur in the Mediterranean against the Tripoli pirates. In 1811, he received command of his first ship, the Enterprise, and was promoted to the Wasp in 1814. It was with the latter that he made his daring reputation. He was ordered across the ocean in May 1814 from Portsmouth, New Hampshire, to do his best to disrupt English Channel shipping. The Wasp took 7 prizes within the first 2 weeks. She engaged in several daring duels with British warships, most notably with the Reindeer and the Avon, which she fought to surrender off Gibraltar. How, you may ask, did Americans operate so freely in European waters at the time? Well, French ports were open to American naval vessels, and they were pleased to assist with medical assistance, repairs, and supplies. The last vessel that Blakely is known to have engaged was a fine sailing ship called the Atalanta, bearing a rich cargo of silk, wine, and brandy. Blakely was so impressed with her that he assigned a contingent of his men to sail her back to the United States. That was the last any American saw of Blakely and his remaining crew. He never returned to North Carolina, and it was assumed that his ship went down with all hands. He was only 33 years of age. Congress posthumously awarded Blakely a gold medal. His wife received a generous federal pension and was offered a presentation sword by the state, but she opted for a silver tea service instead. His only daughter, who was born after his disappearance, was educated at the expense of North Carolina, but she later died during the delivery of her very first child on St. Croix. So, if you have a soldier involved in this war, how would you document that soldier? Let's start first with the federal records. For Colonel Welborn's regiment, the 10th, and various other regular volunteers in which North Carolinians served, your chief resources will be at the National Archives. He was solely responsible for organizing and paying these regular volunteer soldiers. Your documentation will chiefly come from pension applications, bounty land warrant applications, and combined service records, or CSRs. The best place to start are the pensions, which are indexed in 2 National Archives publications: Old War Index to Pensions, T316, 7 rolls of microfilm, and Index to War of 1812 Pension Application Files, Series M313, which consists of 102 rolls at the National Archives. These indexes simply show the enclosing sleeves in which the original pensions are housed, with the summary information recorded in a printed or stamped form on the outside. Images of the microfilm indexes are available online at FamilySearch and Ancestry.com. These are arranged alphabetically by the first letter of the soldier's last name and then by first name, and include widow's applications. Virgil White's 3-volume index to War of 1812 files is a useful alternative to the microform because it includes all related pension entries and also bounty land warrant applications by soldiers who never applied for a pension. There are brief abstracts, but they're not nearly as informative as White's earlier work on the Revolutionary War pensions because I don't think he looked at the original pension files, just the index images of the sleeves. There are 2 types of pensions, as the 2 indexes indicate. Only soldiers who were disabled or widows of soldiers were eligible initially. These are old war pension files, and they are mixed in with disabled and widows pensions from other early wars and applications from peacetime enlisted men of that era. Beginning in 1871 or after, however, a soldier could obtain a pension if he served at least 60 days in the Navy, Marines, or Army, and had remained loyal during the Civil War, regardless of disability. A widow was eligible if she was married to the soldier prior to the 17th of February 1815 at that point. The amount of service was required was lowered in 1878 to a mere 14 days, and any widow of a veteran was eligible at that point. These are the War of 1812 pension files. Gradually, through donations, the pension files themselves in RG15 are being digitized, indexed, and loaded onto fold3.com with the support of FGS and Ancestry.com. And they will be freely accessible there to anyone, regardless of whether you subscribe or not. I think they're getting close to completion if they're not already completed, but you can still request a copy of an individual pension file from the National Archives using Form 85 as usual. Bounty land applications are also useful, though the returned land warrants themselves are of little use. Most soldiers did not retain or occupy this land, but sold the warrant to someone else, and usually that would be a speculator, just as in the Revolutionary War. The early grants were in military districts in Ohio, Missouri, and Arkansas. Many of the bounty land applications are combined into a pension file, but there are cases in which soldiers or widows applied for both, and they remain separate. If the soldier or a widow only applied for the bounty land, they are definitely in the separate series called Bounty Land Warrant Applications, or Unindexed Bounty Land. There are 6,000 boxes of these records at the National Archives, with 50 to 100 files per box. This covers more, however, than just the War of 1812, but also the Mexican War and the Indian Wars prior to the Civil War. There's a digital index being created to these files, and it's available in the search room at the National Archives, but it's not complete. Items of information included are soldier's name, residence, place and date, where he joined the service, commanding officers, and perhaps a unit and where he served. More family information is contained in widows applications. You can ask for a bounty land application search also using Form 85, but remember to specify that you are looking for a bounty land warrant application and give the soldier's name, the war in which he served, rank, state, and the unit in which he served, frequently called by the commander under which he served. If you don't know these facts, you'll either want to establish the spare details of service first, using the compiled index to military service records for the War of 1812, or you may need to go pull the bounty land files in Washington yourself, or hire someone on site to research the possibilities, given duplicate or alternatively spelled names. For volunteer units in the regular Army, and when I say this, I'm talking about like the volunteer regiments or federalized militia, you may also consult a Series M602, the index to compiled military service records of volunteer soldiers who served during the War of 1812. That consists of 234 rolls and is available on Ancestry.com and Family Search. It includes information about dates of service, whether present at roll calls, periods of sickness, and date of death of the soldier if he died in service, even transfers to other units, whether he was a substitute, dates paid, and amounts paid. Information for detached militia who served in the state of North Carolina itself is sure to be spare in this source. However, every mention of a soldier was noted when the Adjutant General, Colonel Ainsworth, made these records in the late 1890s, so it's not necessary to look at the original papers associated with the various units to find out more information. The enlisted soldiers of the peacetime regular Army who participated in the War of 1812 are not included in this source. They must be drawn from the regular Army Registers of Enlistment, Series M233 at NARA, and papers, which can be found on Family Search and is index searchable. Officers will not appear in either of these sources, though. They are noted in a publication, Francis B. Heitman's Historical Register and Dictionary of the United States Army, published in 1903, and R.W. Callahan's List of Officers of the Navy, of the U.S. and Marine Corps from 1775 to 1900, published in 1901. Also the series Abstracts of Service Records of Naval Officers, 1798 to 1893, series M330 at NARA, is useful. Volumes D and E cover the War of 1812. There are no compiled summaries for average seamen as there are for land forces. You kind of have to know what vessel your seamen served on, and so you must try to find a bounty land warrant or pension application to help determine the vessel first. Muster and payroll records for this particular ship can then be used, and if you're lucky, you might even be able to view a ship's logbook, which would tell you where they were from day to day and what their operations were. Also, don't forget to look at the Judge Advocate General records, which have survived for the Army and the Navy. If your ancestor got into trouble, they could be extremely informative. Now, for those detached militiamen from North Carolina who saw only very little duty, there will be little federal documentation, if any. Certainly no land warrants and very minimal, if any, combined service records. Although it is possible that some few individuals or their survivors, more likely the latter, after 1878 may have received pensions based on very limited service. There are several sources of information, however, that are kept at the state archives. First of all, there's muster rolls. There are 5 volumes of muster rolls from the 1812 list. Various of these units were sent to the coast for immediate defense, and they were later called again in 1813 to counteract Coburn's raid. Most of these soldiers were from the east and south central Piedmont. Western regiments from the same list mustered in 1814 to assist with the Creek disturbance. A 6th muster roll reflects the call up in August of 1814, after Washington was burned. Some of these soldiers were sent to Norfolk, some to Wilmington and Newbern for immediate defense. Another call-up of the Western regiments was designated to assist Jackson at New Orleans in January 1815, but the muster at Wadesboro never came to fruition because the war had already come to an end by the time they were ready to set out. Name, rank, officers, dates of beginning and ending service, and distance traveled in service are given. In 1851, the Adjutant General of the state prepared and published a bare-bones version of these rolls as muster rolls of the soldiers of the War of 1812, detached from the militia of North Carolina in 1812 and 1814. And a copy is available in almost any good genealogical library like ours. This volume, however, does not contain full information for each soldier, and it's filled with transcription errors from the original. Nowadays, the State Archives in Raleigh has an online form in which you can use to look up the names of soldiers who served at the militia level, and you can request through that portal for them to do the research and provide you with the references in the original muster rolls to those individuals and send them to you for proof of service or just genealogical research. They've made it very easy, even though there is a fee involved, as you might expect. A second source for state-level records is account books. There are 11 volumes prepared by the Board of Auditors, compiling claims of North Carolina soldiers and civilians in support of coastal defense and the 1815 muster at Wadesboro. Name, rank, length, and type of service, and amounts due for pay are given. These account books are indexed, and you can view them at the archives. Next, there are pay vouchers. Now, when the auditors authenticated a claim against the state for a soldier's pay or for supplies provided by a civilian, the governor's office issued the claimant a voucher, just as they did during the Revolutionary War. This is a voucher or certificate which could then be used to pay taxes and fees to the state, or also might be exchanged as a kind of currency between individuals to pay debts, etc. When the state got these back, it canceled them by punching a hole in the paper. About 5,000 of the vouchers exist, and they are arranged alphabetically by payee. And since they were related to the 1813 coastal defense and the 1815 muster at Wadesboro, not all counties are represented. And finally, we have the pay and the receipt rolls. Rolls were sent with vouchers to the paymasters in each county. Militiamen signed the register upon receiving their voucher. So this list gives the soldier's name, rank, and commanding officer and the amount paid, along with his and a witness's signature. 77 of these rolls have survived. So let's do a little assessment here. Was the War of 1812 a victory for the United States? Even though it ended in a stunning American triumph at New Orleans, which came after the Peace of Ghent had already been signed, most of the American campaigns ended disappointingly, especially with regard to Canada. The 3 abortive attempts to invade were disastrous. Canadians did not flock to the American standard as had been hoped. In fact, Canadians today really consider the war their victory, their declaration of independence from their larger southern neighbor. And it seems the obsession with attaching Canada to our country never ends. But they proved their commitment to remain a part of the British crown at that point and resisted American attempts to annex them. Furthermore, they more than proved their mettle in battle against their neighbor to the south. One would assume that future aggression would provoke the same response. As for the ostensible causes of the war, free trade resumed and impressment ended. But no one could say that the War of 1812 brought these changes about. The orders in council were rescinded in the very month that the U.S. declared war, largely due to the effects of the embargo and the non-intercourse acts. And the need for seamen ended with Napoleon's fall from power in 1814. So trade was probably more hurt by the war than improved by its resolution. Think of the thousands of merchantmen captured and scuttled on both sides during the war, and the drastic reduction in trade for some 7 to 8 years from the time of the embargo. And of course, we must never forget the humiliating occupation of Washington and the flight of the administration before British forces. One can't blame the British for this in the wake of the American sack of York, which was the capital of Upper Canada. The war probably advantaged Napoleon for a while, actually, by creating a diversion for British forces in North America. But if Napoleon had survived or won the war, the United States would not have been the better for that in the long run. The treaty allowed no territorial gains for either side and no reparations of war. The status quo ante was restored. On this basis, it could be called a draw. However, the war was a psychological boost to Americans on the whole, probably because it ended on a high note at New Orleans. American prowess at sea was proved time and again, but mainly due to the work of capitalist buccaneers looking for prizes. The U.S. Navy itself was too small to do anything but hit and run, but on the positive side, the successes at sea finally persuaded Congress of the importance of building up its naval power. And the British were gradually persuaded of the fighting spirit of the Americans and of the need to respect an American sphere of influence in the Western Hemisphere. Meanwhile, she continued to pursue her own imperial dreams in Africa and India and had little energy left over for meddling in the Americas. The real losers of the war, as it turns out, were not the British, but the Indian tribes who followed Tecumseh. Without British support and Tecumseh's charisma, there was no hope for cross-tribal cooperation against American land hunger, and it was only a matter of time before all major eastern tribes would be displaced across the Mississippi.